If you had asked me 5 years ago what my father smelled like, I would have said cologne and authority. That sharp kind of aftershave that fills a room before the man even walks in. Now, if I'm honest, it smells more like old lies. My name is Daniel Hart. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life I believed something about my family that wasn't true. I believed my father was always right. I believed that when he called me weak, it meant I needed to work harder. When he compared me to my younger sister, it meant I needed to improve. When he said I should be grateful for whatever scraps he gave me, I believed that too. Funny thing about manipulation is that when you grow up inside it, it feels like normal air. You don't notice it until someone opens a window. I grew up in a town called Evanston, Illinois. Quiet streets. Big trees. The kind of place where people wave from their porches and pretend every family is perfect. My father, Richard Hart, owned a mid-sized logistics company that handled shipping contracts around the Midwest. Nothing glamorous, but enough money that everyone assumed we were doing well. My mother taught piano lessons from home. And my younger sister, Emily, well, Emily was my father's favorite. That wasn't a secret. It was practically a family tradition. Emily was 2 years younger than me, but if you listen to my father talk, you'd think she'd invented electricity. Emily has real drive, he'd say at dinner. Emily understands business. Emily actually applies herself. Then he'd glance at me across the table and add something like, Daniel's figuring things out, which, translated from Richard Hart language, meant disappointment. The strange part? I tried harder because of it. I worked 2 part-time jobs in high school, stocking shelves at a grocery store and fixing computers for neighbors. I graduated with a 3.9 GPA. I got accepted into Purdue's engineering program. I thought stupidly that if I kept achieving things, eventually my father would look at me the way he looked at Emily, with pride. Instead, the day my acceptance letter arrived, he skimmed it for about 10 seconds and said, "Engineering's expensive." That was it. No congratulations. Just a sigh. Then he added something I didn't understand at the time. Well, we'll see what we can do. Here's the detail that matters. When my maternal grandparents passed away, they left behind 2 education funds. One for me, one for Emily. My grandmother had been extremely organized. She left paperwork, letters, instructions, everything. Each fund had about $110,000 in it, enough to pay for college without debt. I remember the day my mom told me about it. We were sitting at the kitchen table. She slid a folder across to me. Your grandparents wanted to make sure you kids started life without loans. I felt like someone had lifted a weight off my chest. For the first time, the future didn't look terrifying. I remember saying, Dad must be relieved. My mom hesitated, just for a second. Then she nodded. Yes, of course. Looking back, that pause should have meant something. But at 18, you don't notice pauses. 3 months later, my father called me into his office. Not the office at home. His real office downtown. Glass building. Gray carpet. The kind of place that smells like printers and stale coffee. He closed the door and sat behind his desk. Daniel, we need to talk about finances. I nodded. College is expensive, he said again. Yes, but Grandma's fund. He cut me off with a wave of his hand. That money isn't accessible right now. I blinked. What do you mean? Complicated legal issues. How complicated? Too complicated for you to worry about. Then he leaned back in his chair and gave me that look. The one that always made me feel 12 years old. You're going to need student loans. I remember sitting there in silence. Something felt off. But Emily's fund. That's different. How? Emily's pursuing business, he said. As in your business? He smiled. Exactly. That was the first time I remember feeling something strange in my chest. Not anger. More like confusion. But I swallowed it. Because that's what I always did. I took out loans. By the time I graduated, I owed $86,000. Emily, meanwhile, attended Northwestern. My father paid for everything. Tuition. Apartment. Even a car. At family dinners he'd say things like, Emily's going places. Then glance at me and add, Daniel's surviving. Everyone would laugh. Even me. Especially me. Because when humiliation becomes routine, you start laughing before anyone else can. For years I thought this was normal family behavior. Until I met Claire. Claire Benson. My fiancé. She's a nurse. Grew up in Ohio. The kind of person who actually says what she means. The first time she met my parents was Thanksgiving. Everything went exactly how it always did. My father praised Emily. He criticized my career choices. He made a comment about how engineering wasn't exactly leadership material. Claire stayed quiet through dinner. But later in the car she asked a question that changed everything. Does your dad always talk to you like that? I shrugged. Pretty much. That's not normal. Sure it is. No, she said. It's not. That conversation kept happening. Little by little. Claire would notice things I'd ignored for decades. Why did Emily get financial help but I didn't? Why did my father control every family decision? Why did my mother look nervous whenever money was mentioned? And the biggest question, what happened to your college fund? I repeated the same answer every time. Legal issues. Claire frowned. What legal issues? I don't know. Did you ever ask? Not really. She stared at me like I just admitted I'd never learned to read. Daniel. That's $110,000. I know. And you never checked? He's my father. That was the moment she said something I'll never forget. Family doesn't mean blind trust. Sometimes it just means the betrayal takes longer to notice. I laughed at the time. I shouldn't have. About 6 months later, Claire did something I never would have done. She started asking questions. Quiet ones. She had a friend whose husband worked in forensic accounting. Another friend who handled estate law. First it felt ridiculous. Like we were investigating a conspiracy. But then the first strange detail appeared. The education funds weren't frozen. They had been closed. Almost 10 years earlier. By the account trustee. My father. I remember the night Claire told me. We were sitting on our apartment floor eating takeout Chinese. She slid a printed document toward me. Daniel. I think your dad took the money. I laughed. Actually laughed. That's impossible. She pointed to the transaction line. Withdrawal. $220,000. 2 accounts. Same date. Same authorization. Richard Hart. For the first time in my life, something about my father didn't smell like cologne. Smelled like rot. And that was only the beginning. Because once we started looking deeper, we discovered my father wasn't just stealing from his children. He was also sleeping with the accountant who managed his company's books. For almost 7 years. Her name was Linda Park. And the evidence? Well, let's just say accountants are very good at leaving paper trails. I remember sitting in silence after we saw everything. Claire reached over and squeezed my hand. What do you want to do? I stared at the wall. For 33 years I had been quiet, polite, grateful, small. And suddenly, I wasn't. I looked at Claire and said something that surprised even me. We're getting married in October. She nodded. Yes. And my father will give a speech. Yes. I took a deep breath. Then I said, if he humiliates me again in front of everyone. I paused. We're going to show them everything. Claire raised an eyebrow. How many guests? About 180. She smiled slowly. Then maybe your dad shouldn't make a scene. The wedding was 6 months away. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to earn my father's approval. Instead, I started preparing his downfall. After you discover something like that, the world doesn't explode the way movies suggest. There's no dramatic music. No thunderstorm outside the window. Instead, life continues in the most irritatingly normal way possible. You still wake up. You still go to work. You still answer emails. And somewhere in the back of your mind sits a quiet sentence. Your father stole from you. It took a few weeks before the anger actually arrived. First it was disbelief. Then confusion. Then something colder. Claire approached it differently. Where I processed things emotionally, she treated the situation like a medical diagnosis. Step 1. Confirm the symptoms. Step 2. Gather data. Step 3. Plan treatment. She printed documents. Lots of them. Bank records. Trust documents from my grandmother's estate. Transfer authorizations. Tax filings from my father's company. Our apartment dining table slowly transformed into something that looked like a low-budget detective show. Stacks of paper everywhere. Highlighter marks. Sticky notes. One night I walked into the room and Claire was squinting at a spreadsheet like it had personally insulted her. "Did you know?" she said without looking up. "Your father's accountant has been with the company exactly 8 years? Linda Park." "Yep. That means." She started 1 year before the education funds disappeared. We didn't jump to conclusions. Well, Claire didn't. I did. But she insisted on evidence. "Emotion is useful," she told me. "But proof wins." So she contacted her friend Mark. Mark was the forensic accountant I mentioned earlier. We met him at a small bar near the hospital where Claire worked. He looked exactly like someone who spends his life reading financial records. Thin, quiet, slightly amused by everything. I slid the folder of documents across the table. "Hypothetically," I said, "if someone withdrew 2 trust funds that didn't belong to them." Mark flipped through the pages. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. Finally he said something that made my stomach drop. "This isn't hypothetical." Claire leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Mark tapped a page. "The trustee was legally allowed to move the funds." My shoulders slumped. "So it wasn't illegal?" "Oh no," he said calmly. "It's absolutely illegal. Here's the detail that mattered. My grandparents will clearly stated the education funds could only be used for tuition, housing, or academic expenses. Instead, the money had been transferred into an operating account for Heart Logistics." Mark circled the transaction date. "Your father used it as working capital." "For the business?" "Yes. And that's illegal?" "Very." "How bad?" Mark shrugged. "Best case? Civil fraud. Worst case? Criminal embezzlement." Hearing those words felt strange. Not satisfying. Just heavy. Because no matter what he'd done, Richard Hart was still my father. Then Mark flipped another page. "This is interesting." Claire and I leaned closer. "What?" she asked. "There are recurring payments from the company to a private account." "How much?" "About $4,000 a month." "For what?" Mark looked up. "Unknown consulting services." Claire tilted her head. "That sounds fake." Mark nodded. "It probably is." 2 days later, Claire called me while I was at work. Her voice sounded like someone who had just solved a puzzle. "Daniel." "Yeah. I found Linda." "What do you mean?" "Her consulting account. And she owns a condo downtown." "Okay. Guess who co-signed the mortgage?" I already knew the answer, but I asked anyway. "My father." "Yes." That was the moment the second betrayal hit. The first one was financial. Cold. Mathematical. But this one involved my mother. I drove to my parents' house that night. Not to confront anyone. Just to look. The house hadn't changed since I was a teenager. Same oak tree in the yard. Same porch light flickering. Inside, my mother was practicing piano with a student. Soft music drifted through the hallway. My father sat in the living room watching a financial news channel. He glanced up when I entered. "Daniel." "Hey." He muted the television. "How's work?" "Fine." "Still designing bridges?" "Something like that." He nodded approvingly. "Well, at least that's practical." Even then, even knowing what I knew. He couldn't help himself. Emily arrived about 20 minutes later. Perfect hair. Perfect smile. She hugged my father first. Then my mother. Then me. "How's wedding planning?" she asked. "Good. I still can't believe you're getting married before me." Dad chuckled. "Well, Emily's focused on her career." He glanced at me. "Daniel moves faster." There was a pause. Then he added, "Sometimes too fast." Everyone laughed. Again. Even me. Because that old habit was hard to break. But something had changed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't listening to his words. I was studying him. The way he held his phone close. The way he stepped outside to take certain calls. The way my mother's shoulders tightened whenever Linda's name came up in conversation. Small details. Little cracks. Once you know where to look, you see everything. Claire and I spent the next 2 months gathering proof. Not guesses. Proof. Mark helped us trace the original trust withdrawals. $220,000. Transferred in 2 stages, then slowly redistributed through the company, some used for payroll, some for equipment leases, some missing entirely. Meanwhile, Claire's lawyer friend, Amanda, looked into the legal side. If this goes public, Amanda told us, your father's company could collapse. How quickly? I asked. Depends on his partners. Hart Logistics had 3 major investors. One of them owned nearly 40% of the company. A man named George Dalton. Amanda tapped the contract. If Dalton finds out about fraud, he'll run. Then there was the affair. That evidence came from a different direction. Phones, emails, hotel receipts. Mark traced several company expense reimbursements, all approved by Linda Park. Dinner for 2. Hotel stays. Conference trips that never had conferences. One email exchange stood out. It was short. 3 lines. Linda had written, "Your son is getting married soon. Should I come?" My father replied, "Of course. You're practically family." That email made Claire laugh. A short, dark laugh. "Well," she said, "that's convenient." By early summer we had everything. Documents, emails, financial transfers, hotel receipts, even security footage from one of the company's buildings showing my father and Linda leaving together late at night. Mark leaned back in his chair when we showed him the full folder. "This is enough." "For what?" I asked. "For a prosecutor." "But we're not going to a prosecutor," Claire said. "Not yet." Mark looked between us. "Then what are you doing?" I answered. "We're getting married. Here's something people don't tell you about revenge. It's mostly paperwork. Spreadsheets. Quiet planning. Long conversations at midnight." Claire and I didn't want chaos. We wanted timing. The wedding had 187 guests. Family, friends, business associates. 2 of my father's partners. Even George Dalton, the biggest investor. My father had insisted on inviting half the city. Networking opportunity, he called it. He had no idea how right he was. One night, about a month before the wedding, Claire asked a simple question. "What if he behaves?" "What do you mean?" "What if he gives a nice speech?" I thought about that. Really thought about it. Then I said something surprising. "Then nothing happens." Claire blinked. "You'd let him get away with it?" "No." I shook my head. "But the plan only works if he does what he always does." "And what's that?" I smiled slightly. "Humiliate me." The funny part? Planning revenge changed me. Slowly. Quietly. For years I had been the passive one. The apologetic one. But every new document we added to the folder made something inside me steadier. Less afraid. More certain. Claire noticed it first. "You're different," she said one evening. "Better different or scary different?" "Both." I took that as a compliment. 3 weeks before the wedding, my father called me. "Daniel, quick question." "Yeah. I'm preparing my speech." "Oh. You don't mind a little humor, right?" I could practically hear the smirk through the phone. "What kind of humor?" "Oh, you know. Stories. Childhood things. Funny failures." I closed my eyes for a second, then said calmly, "Go for it." "Good," he replied. "I wouldn't want to embarrass you too much." After I hung up, Claire looked at me. "Well." I smiled. Phase 2. We printed 187 small envelopes. Inside each one was a single sheet of paper. A summary of the evidence. Clean. Simple. Undeniable. Claire asked, "Is this too dramatic?" I shook my head. "Not dramatic. Strategic." Then we prepared the final piece. A slideshow. Emails. Bank records. Photos. All time-stamped. All real. And all ready to appear on a projector screen the moment my father finished his speech. Because if Richard Hart wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone, I was finally ready to return the favor, just with better documentation. And the wedding day was getting birds disappear. Even the wind seems to be waiting. I woke up at 6:10 a.m. in a hotel room overlooking Lake Michigan. Gray sky. Light rain tapping against the window. Claire was still asleep beside me. For a few minutes I just lay there staring at the ceiling. thinking about something simple. 34 years. That's how long I had spent trying to make my father proud. 34 years of adjusting myself, working harder, speaking softer, laughing at jokes that made me the punchline. It's strange how a person can shrink their whole life just to fit inside someone else's approval. And stranger still when they finally decide not to. Claire woke up around 7. She stretched, squinted at the rain outside, and said the most practical sentence imaginable. Well, at least nobody will want to leave early. I laughed. You're assuming they'll want to stay. She rolled onto her side and studied my face. You okay? I thought about the folder sitting in the safe downstairs, the envelopes, the slideshow, all the quiet preparation of the last 6 months. Yeah, I said. I'm okay. Claire nodded. Then she added something I didn't expect. You know we don't have to do this. What do you mean? If you want to walk away after the wedding, we can. No revenge. No confrontation. Just a new life. For a moment that idea sounded incredibly peaceful. Then I remembered my father's voice. Daniel's figuring things out. And I shook my head. No. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Simple. Small church. About 200 people filling the pews. Emily sat in the front row beside my parents. My father wore a navy suit and the same silver watch he'd worn my entire childhood. When Claire walked down the aisle, everything else disappeared for a few minutes. The plan, the evidence, the anger, all of it. It was just her and me standing at the altar promising something simple. Honesty, respect. The two things my family had never really understood. If the story ended right there, it would have been perfect. But of course it didn't. The reception took place at a lakeside hotel ballroom. Big windows, string lights, a dance floor surrounded by round tables. Exactly 187 guests. According to the seating chart Claire had triple-checked. Business partners, extended relatives, college friends, neighbors, and at table number 7 right near the center, George Dalton, my father's biggest investor. He arrived exactly how you'd expect a multimillionaire to arrive. Quietly, confidently. My father greeted him like royalty. George, glad you could make it. Dalton shook his hand. Wouldn't miss your son's wedding. If he had known what the evening would turn into, he probably would have. Dinner started around 7:30 p.m. Chicken, salmon, polite conversation. My father moved from table to table like a politician, shaking hands, telling stories. Emily followed behind him, smiling like she was already preparing to inherit the company. Claire squeezed my hand under the table. Still calm. Still calm. Good. She nodded toward the DJ booth. Our friend Marcus stood behind the laptop that controlled the projector. He gave us a tiny thumbs up. Everything was ready. At 8:15 the speeches began. First was Claire's maid of honor. Sweet. Emotional. Lots of stories about nursing school. Then my best man. He told a slightly embarrassing story about my terrible haircut in college. Everyone laughed. Normal wedding stuff. Then the DJ tapped the microphone. And now the father of the groom. The room applauded. My stomach tightened. Claire squeezed my hand again. Remember, she whispered. He gets one chance. My father walked to the center of the dance floor holding a glass of whiskey. He looked comfortable, confident, like a man who had delivered hundreds of speeches before, which he probably had. He tapped the microphone once. Good evening, everyone. More applause. He smiled at Claire. First of all, welcome to the family. Then he turned toward me. And congratulations to my son. There was a pause. The kind of pause that meant something unpleasant was coming. And right on schedule it did. When Daniel was a child, my father began. He was, how should I say this? He chuckled. A bit lost. Polite laughter from the audience. He once tried to build a treehouse that collapsed in 2 days. More laughter. He started 3 different sports teams and quit all of them. Emily laughed loudly from her table. And when he chose engineering, my father continued. I thought, well, at least Bridges can't run away from him. The crowd laughed again. My father raised his glass. But despite his challenges, Daniel always meant well. Claire's fingers tightened around mine. Here it comes, she whispered. My father leaned closer to the microphone. Now Claire, he said, you should know something important about my son. He's sensitive. A few people chuckled. He takes criticism very seriously. Then he smiled. But don't worry. I've spent his whole life toughening him up. The laughter grew louder. And that's when he delivered the line. The one that ended everything. Without me, my father said proudly, Daniel probably wouldn't be standing here today. The room erupted in laughter and applause. Everyone assumed it was a joke. A normal father-son moment. But I noticed something. George Dalton didn't laugh. He just watched. Curious. Waiting. And that was the moment I stood up. Dad, I said calmly. The microphone was still in his hand. He turned toward me, smiling. Yes, Daniel. Can I add something? The crowd quieted. My father shrugged and handed me the microphone. Of course. Go ahead. I looked around the room. 187 people. Friends. Family. Business partners. Then I looked at Marcus. He nodded once. The projector behind us flickered to life. A blank white screen appeared. My father frowned slightly. What's this? I spoke into the microphone. You're right about one thing, Dad. Oh, I did learn a lot from you. He smiled again. Well, that's good to hear. I nodded. Yes. Mostly about honesty. The first slide appeared on the screen. A bank document. Large red circle around a number. $220,000. The room went silent. My father's smile faded. What is this? He asked quietly. I continued speaking. This is the education fund my grandparents left for Emily and me. Another slide appeared. A transfer authorization. Trustee? Richard Hart. Murmurs spread across the room. My father's face turned pale. Daniel, he said sharply. Stop this. But I didn't. The next slide showed company accounts. Then tax filings. Then the transfer into Hart Logistics. A whisper traveled across the ballroom like wind through leaves. Claire stood beside me now. Calm. Steady. I spoke clearly into the microphone. For years I believed my college fund disappeared because of legal problems. Another slide appeared. A simple line of text. There were no legal problems. Instead, I continued, my father used the money to support his company. George Dalton leaned forward in his chair, studying the screen. My father stepped closer to me. His voice low. You have no idea what you're doing. Oh, Ido. Another slide appeared. Hotel receipts. Emails. Photos. Linda Park's name. My father froze. The room went completely silent. I read one line from the email aloud. Your son is getting married soon. Should I come? Then I read the reply. Of course. You're practically family. Gasps filled the ballroom. Someone dropped a glass. My mother covered her mouth. Emily stared at the screen like she had forgotten how to blink. And George Dalton slowly stood up from his chair. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply walked toward my father. Richard, he said calmly, we need to talk tomorrow. Then he turned and left the ballroom. Just like that. One investor. 40% of the company. Gone. My father looked around the room. At the screen. At the documents. At the 187 witnesses. And for the first time in my entire life, Richard Hart looked small. Very small. I handed the microphone back to him. But he didn't take it. Instead he whispered one sentence. You've ruined everything. I shook my head. No. You did that. Claire touched my arm. Marcus turned off the projector. Guests sat frozen in their chairs. Nobody knew what to say. Which was perfect. Because for the first time in 34 years, my father had nothing to say either. And the truth had finally entered the room. After the projector turned off, the ballroom stayed quiet for several seconds. Not awkward quiet. Not confused quiet. More like the stunned silence that follows a loud crash. People weren't sure whether to move, speak, or pretend nothing had happened. Someone near the back coughed. A waiter froze halfway through pouring wine. And my father just stood there. If you've spent your whole life watching someone dominate every room they enter, it's strange to suddenly see that power disappear. It's like watching gravity turn off. My mother was the first person to move. She stood slowly from her chair. For a moment I thought she might walk toward me. Instead she walked toward the projector screen. The blank white surface. The place where the emails had been just seconds earlier. She stared at it for a long time. Then she turned to my father. "Richard," she said quietly. "Is it true?" My father opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "This isn't the place." "That's not what I asked." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room sharper than anything else that night. "Is it true?" My father looked around the ballroom. At the guests. At Emily. At me. At the door George Dalton had just walked through. For the first time, his usual confidence had nowhere to go. "It's complicated," he said finally. "If there is a universal phrase used by guilty people everywhere, that's probably it." My mother nodded slowly. "Complicated." She repeated the word like she was testing how it tasted. Then she said something that made the entire room hold its breath. "I think we should live separately for a while." The sentence was calm, measured, almost gentle, but its meaning hit my father like a truck. "Margaret, I need space. You're overreacting." "I don't think I am." Emily stood up quickly. "Mom, wait." But my mother had already picked up her purse. She looked at me once. Not angry, not accusing, just tired, very tired. Then she walked out of the ballroom. I remember thinking how small that moment looked. No shouting, no dramatic exit. Just a quiet decision. But sometimes quiet decisions change entire lives. Guests began whispering. A few people slipped out the doors. Others stayed frozen in their chairs, unsure whether they were witnessing family drama or corporate collapse. Because for some of them, it was both. One of my father's other partners walked up slowly. His name was Kevin Walsh. He leaned close to my father and spoke quietly, but not quietly enough. "Richard, tell me this isn't real." My father didn't answer. Kevin exhaled sharply. "We'll talk Monday." Then he left too. Claire squeezed my hand. "You okay?" I looked around the room. At the half-finished dinners. At the scattered wine glasses. At the envelope sitting quietly at each place setting. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." Felt strange. Not triumphant. Not victorious. Just lighter. Like someone had removed a heavy backpack. I didn't realize I'd been carrying my entire life. The envelopes were opened about 10 minutes later. At first only one or two guests noticed them. Then more. Inside each envelope was a simple one-page summary. Dates. Transfers. Emails. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. Across the ballroom people began reading. Then rereading. Then exchanging looks with each other. One man muttered, "Holy hell." Another guest whispered, "That's detailed." Accountants appreciate documentation. So do lawyers. And apparently wedding guests. My father didn't open his envelope. He didn't need to. He already knew what it contained. Instead he walked directly toward me. Claire stepped slightly closer to my side. But I shook my head. "It's okay." My father stopped about 3 feet away. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he said something I never expected. "You planned this?" "Yes." "For months?" "Yes." He laughed once. Short. Bitter. "I underestimated you." That sentence might sound like an insult. But strangely, it felt like the closest thing to respect my father had ever given me. Funny how life works. "Why now?" he asked. "Why not years ago?" "Because I didn't know." "And when you found out?" "I waited." "For what?" "For you to do what you always do." My father's eyes narrowed. "Which is?" I glanced toward the empty microphone stand. "Humiliate me in public." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "You've destroyed your own family." I took a breath before answering. "No." I stopped protecting a lie. For a few seconds it looked like he might say something else. Maybe yell. Maybe threaten. Maybe deny everything. Instead he just looked old. Not physically older, but suddenly tired in a way I had never seen before. Finally he turned around and walked toward the exit. Alone. No dramatic confrontation. No shouting match. Just a man leaving a room where the truth had finally caught up with him. The ballroom slowly began returning to life. Music started again. Quietly at first. A few guests approached Claire and me. Some offered congratulations. Others offered awkward sympathy. One older woman patted my arm and said, "Well, that was memorable," which might be the most polite way anyone has ever described a family implosion. About 30 minutes later, Marcus joined us at the table. "On a scale of 1 to 10, he said, "that was about a 12. Claire laughed. "You think we overdid it?" "No," he said. "I think historians will study this wedding." The rest of the reception was strange but surprisingly warm. Friends gathered around us. People danced. Someone requested an old 90s song and half the room joined the dance floor. Life, it turns out, doesn't stop just because the truth becomes inconvenient. And maybe that's a good thing. Over the next few weeks, consequences began arriving. Not dramatically, but steadily. George Dalton officially withdrew his investment from Hart Logistics. Without his funding, the company struggled to cover operating costs. 2 major contracts were canceled within a month. Kevin Walsh quietly resigned as partner. By the end of the quarter, the company announced organizational restructuring, which is corporate language for things are collapsing. Meanwhile, my mother filed for legal separation. She moved into a small condo about 15 minutes away from the old house. We met for coffee one afternoon. Neither of us mentioned the wedding at first. Instead, we talked about simple things. Her piano students. Claire's hospital shifts. The weather. Finally, she said softly, "I should have asked questions sooner." I shook my head. I should have too. Families are complicated that way. Sometimes everyone sees the cracks. But nobody wants to be the first person to say something. Emily called me exactly once. Her voice sounded distant. "You embarrassed Dad." "No," I said quietly. "He embarrassed himself." She didn't respond. After a long pause, she hung up. We haven't spoken since. And my father. I heard small updates through relatives. The company shrank. Some employees left. Others stayed out of loyalty or necessity. Linda Park resigned from her position 2 months later. Apparently, the investigation from the investors made her job uncomfortable. Funny how consequences work. They don't arrive all at once. They arrive slowly. Like interest on a debt that was ignored too long. One evening about 3 months after the wedding, Claire and I were sitting on our apartment balcony watching the sunset. She leaned her head on my shoulder. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Which part?" "Everything." I thought about that for a long time. The wedding. The projector. The envelopes. My father walking out of the room. Then I answered honestly, "No." Not because revenge felt good, but because silence had felt worse. About 6 months after the wedding, something strange happened. Nothing dramatic. No sadene palegi. No courtroom drama. No late-night phone call from my father begging for forgiveness. Instead, I woke up one morning and realized something simple. I hadn't thought about him for 3 days. For most of my life, my father's opinion had lived in my head like background noise. Every decision had passed through that invisible filter. Would he approve? Would he criticize this? Would this prove him wrong? Even after the wedding, I expected that voice to linger. But slowly, quietly, it faded. Like a radio station losing signal as you drive farther away. Claire noticed the change before I did. We were grocery shopping one Saturday afternoon, arguing about something ridiculous. Whether we actually needed 3 different types of pasta. She stopped in the middle of the aisle and looked at me. "You're lighter." "Lighter?" "Yeah." I held up a box of spaghetti. "You mean emotionally, or because I skipped dessert this week?" She smiled. "Emotionally." I didn't have a clever answer for that. Because she was right. For the first time in decades, I wasn't carrying my father's expectations around like a backpack full of bricks. Life after the wedding didn't magically become perfect. Student loans still existed. Work deadlines still existed. And sometimes family holidays felt complicated. But something important had shifted. The power dynamic was gone. I wasn't the quiet son trying to earn approval anymore. I was just a man building his own life. Claire and I moved the following spring. Not far. Just across town into a small house with a porch and a maple tree in the yard. Nothing fancy. But it was ours. The first weekend we moved in, we spent an entire afternoon assembling furniture from a box store that clearly hated humanity. Halfway through building a bookshelf, Claire looked at the instructions and sighed. I think step 6 requires divine intervention. I stared at the diagram. Or a power drill. We both laughed. Moments like that felt strangely important. Not because they were exciting, but because they were peaceful. And peace had been missing from my life for a very long time. My relationship with my mother slowly improved. She visited the house one afternoon carrying a pie she had absolutely not baked herself. Store labels still attached. We sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee. At one point she said quietly, I used to think keeping the peace meant staying silent. I nodded. I thought that too. She looked out the window for a moment. Turns out silence doesn't keep peace. What does? She shrugged slightly. Truth. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was an honest one. Occasionally, updates about my father still reached me through distant relatives. Hart Logistics eventually sold most of its assets to another company. The name disappeared from industry listings. Some people said my father tried to start a smaller consulting business. Others said he moved out of the old house and rented an apartment downtown. I never confirmed any of it. Not because I was avoiding the truth, but because I realized something important. I didn't need updates anymore. One evening Claire asked me something I hadn't considered before. Do you think he'll ever apologize? I thought about it carefully. My father had spent his entire life protecting his own image. Admitting fault wasn't exactly part of his personality. Probably not, I said. Does that bother you? I shook my head. No. Claire raised an eyebrow. Really? Really? Because the strange thing about closure is that it doesn't always come from the other person. Sometimes it comes from finally seeing the situation clearly. And once you see it clearly, you stop waiting. A year after the wedding, Claire and I returned to the same lakeside hotel where everything had happened. Not for revenge. Not for confrontation. Just for dinner. The ballroom looked completely normal again. New decorations. Different event. Different families celebrating different milestones. No projecte screens. No whispered conversations. Just music and laughter. It felt oddly comforting. Proof that life moves forward whether you want it to or not. As we walked back to the car that night, Claire slipped her hand into mine. You know, she said. Most people think revenge is about hurting someone else. Yeah. I think yours was about something different. Like what? She thought for a moment. Stopping the cycle. I considered that. And she might have been right. Because the real change hadn't been exposing my father. The real change had been refusing to stay small anymore. Growing up under manipulation teaches you strange lessons. You learn to doubt yourself. You learn to keep quiet. You learn that conflict is dangerous and approval is survival. But eventually, if you're lucky, someone opens a window. Someone like Claire. And fresh air enters the room. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's something simple. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like patience, documentation, strategy, and the willingness to wait until the truth can stand on its own. The best revenge, though? It's not destroying someone. It's building a life where their control no longer matters. These days my life is fairly ordinary. Work, dinner with Claire, occasional visits from my mom, weekend projects around the house. Nothing dramatic. And honestly, that's exactly how I like it. Because for most of my life, drama was someone else's way of keeping me small. Now it's just background noise. Sometimes people ask if I hate my father. The answer surprises them. I don't. Hate requires energy. And I'd rather spend mine on something better. Like living well. If Richard Hart taught me anything valuable, it wasn't his business advice. It wasn't his speeches. And it definitely wasn't his parenting style. The real lesson came from watching what happens when someone believes power is permanent. Because power built on manipulation eventually collapses. Truth has a way of showing up. Even if it takes 34 years. And when it does, you finally realize something important. You were never small. You were just standing in the wrong shadow.